Actually, we're going to start first.
Huh?
What are you going on about?
All right.
Making nonsense at this point.
All right, on that note, hey folks, it is January the 19th, and this is our U.S. History class, and we're picking back up the Cold War. And so, if you'll recall, we left off with the end of World War II, and with the end of World War II, you had the United States and Russia were in competition over who they could have their influence over. And we saw that the Russians were willing to do things like invade countries without any cause for war. They would just invade to try to take over. This caused international crisis. Eventually, we managed to get them to pull back sometimes, such as in Iran. And then we discussed, we had President Truman witnessed Winston Churchill give his Iron Curtain speech, which was part of your reading assignment. So please make sure that you go to the Google Classroom and you finish that up if you haven't finished it up already. If you have finished it, I'm going to grade it as soon as possible and all that good stuff. In fact, I need to go last assignment too. So get caught up on that. I am kind of considering we might have a quiz assignment coming up, because we need to have more assessments to see how folks are doing, but I'll fill you in on that next week. So maybe Thursday or Friday next week, we'll have just a little something just to check your pulse and see if you're keeping up. All right. So the Iron Curtain was not just figurative; it was also it was also depicted a literal separation in the world. And this was signified in Germany. If you'll recall, Germany was divided up between the Allied countries, and Russia is going to have very stiff, oppressive control of their part in the east. And this is going to be especially signified in the city of Berlin. This brings us to Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. In 1947, President Truman announced America's new anti-communist foreign policy known as the Truman Doctrine. Remember, for our warm-up, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine. And so doctrine is essentially a teaching, but like traditionally, but for our purposes, a doctrine is policy. It's how the government is going to act. It's our goal. And so the goal in the Truman Doctrine is that we were going to help countries that are threatened by communists, and we were going to try to stop the spread of communism. And we would do this with military and economic aid. So military aid could be with us offering troops for protection, but it could also be us giving them implements of war, like weapons, bombs, equipment. If you'll notice, much of the world's still like that today. Much of the world, if you look at their militaries, especially poor countries, they either use military weaponry that is based off U.S. designs or Russian designs. We can tell the difference between an M16 or an AK-47 if you look around at other countries.
Who gave the AKs to the Afghanistan now?
Yeah.
They have a lot of Soviet guns.
They do because, well, it's not like they buy them from Russians. A lot of AKs are really easy to make cheaply, like with factories. And so the Russians, for like way back in the day, would make allies, and they'd be like, hey, we'll show you how to make them, we'll ship them to you. And so they just start making their own, a lot of these countries. That doesn't mean Afghanis were making these things, but like you can, like there's yeah, like China would make them, Russia would make them, a lot of Middle East, like Egypt, a lot of countries had their own factories to make those things. Whereas M16s are all made in America. Yeah, so at least. All right, so within this doctrine, or said that one of the first actions of this new policy was started by Truman's Secretary of State, a guy called George Marshall. And Marshall devised a program that would bring economic aid to post-World War II Europe in his Marshall Plan, so that the continent's prosperity and stability might be restored. So the idea was communist uprisings usually start when people are really suffering and really poor. They need something different. They need to eat. They need change. And so the people radicalize and they help out with the communist revolution. But you also had pressure from the Soviets who were using like their spy agencies like the KGB to help foment revolutions. So the idea for America was to, if we can help out these people to have more stable lives by bringing them things like food aid, money in order to rebuild, and things like that, we could boost our own economy by having them make loans from us and buy material from us, cars and things like that, and at the same time make good friends, right? So the Second World War destroyed so much of the production of Europe, so many factories and stuff like that. They couldn't meet their own needs. Their farms were all tore up, and all their working age people were dead or injured. And so, however, in America, we didn't have the same casualties, and our factories were still working. We still had all these boats and things to send stuff over. So yeah, we had this, essentially half the world was our consumers to our products. So being an industrial economy, this really worked in our favor. The money and aid was offered to all of Europe. We even offered it to the Russians because they were very, very beat up from the war as well when the Germans came in. The Soviets rejected the aid because it would lead to Western economic integration and also the purchasing of American products. So they didn't want to do this because it would show a sign of weakness. They wanted to show that the communist system was superior to us. And even though they needed the aid, they didn't want to accept it because, well, one, it wouldn't look good propaganda at home. If they're like, hey, the food from America tastes better and the tools work better and all this and that, maybe we should do things like Americans. And another thing is they wanted to not only rebuild their own stuff, but they wanted others to get stuff from them to make their own ideas on how things could go. So they thought, we can't compete if we're just relying on you. And they knew, both sides knew that we were essentially our new enemies. We were enemies with them. It was like World War III was just on the cusp already. So the most important part you need to know is Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine, like just a little bit of what they are. But please remember, don't write all this stuff down. All right, let's move on. All right. So once again, like I said, this is Germany, and all of Germany was divided up amongst the Allies. You see, America had the gold part. France, along its border, had this blue. Great Britain, across the English Channel, had the green. And the Soviets had this part in the east. However, confusingly enough, this area here is Berlin. That's the capital of Germany. And it was further divided up. So you'll notice within this sea of red, Soviet-controlled territory, Soviet-controlled Germany, you had certain blotches here that were controlled by America and Great Britain and France.
Is that entire thing Germany?
Yeah, the whole thing here is Germany, all the colors.
Wow.
And so you'll see here, half the eastern part of Berlin is red. So it's controlled by the Soviets. The rest of the city, West Berlin, is known as Free Berlin. The problem is, though, to get in and out of Berlin, you had to go through Soviet territory. This is going to make an unfair advantage of control over these people from the Soviets, and that's going to lead to some international crisis. In 1947, the Soviets announced the Molotov Plan to counter the Marshall Plan and incorporate Eastern Europe into their sphere of influence. So the idea of this is like, hey, the countries that they control in Eastern Europe, they're satellites. Instead, we're going to offer you aid. And when we offer you aid, you have to reject American aid. And so we're going to see that this is going to come to like standardization, whereas like American products are going to come like with different kinds of features, like measurements, for example. So like we measure things with inches and yards. They measure it with centimeters and meters. Whereas we have to turn a screw to the right to tighten it. They had to turn screws. So things weren't even interchangeable, right? So it was like, everything. Yeah, it's true though. It's true. A lot of things were backwards. And some of it may have been done intentional just to make sure
How do you say
things
that?
could work together.
Sorry, how do you say that word?
Czechoslovakia?
Oh, you say what?
Yeah.
Checo?
What? Checo?
Checo?
Yeah.
Checo, like
Czech.
Czech.
Yeah, Czechoslovakia.
Slovakia.
Slovakia. Slovakia.
It's supposed to be a nice country.
Czechoslovakia.
So
I never been.
Slovakia. Oh, guys, I'm.
There you go. All right.
Slav.
I don't got no Mexican.
So we're seeing like more and more division like throughout the world, right? So this country does one thing, this one's going to be like, well, we're going to do the same thing, but against you. In 1948, the Soviets helped overthrow the government of Czechoslovakia. So this is like Americans' fears. You have Russians overthrowing legitimate governments in a country and installing a communist government. They're like, oh my gosh, it would be like something like that happening here. They're like, this is exactly what we're scared of. The coup led to the congressional approval of $12.5 billion attached to the Marshall Plan. So this helped Congress, instilled with fear, start pumping a bunch of money into this Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe and help offer them lots of aid. And that's back then money too, so that must have been worth a lot. As the aid began to arrive in Germany, the U.S. helped Western Germany hold elections and draft a new constitution. So those people who were Germans and Nazis were trying to help them become more modern, peaceful people, trying to denazify Western Germany, trying to make them part of the world's nations and maybe not have like crazy ideals. The Russians then blocked all traffic to Berlin. They're like, they didn't like that we were pushing Western style democracy. And so they're going to block traffic to Berlin. They're going to cut off aid. So if you remember from that map, it's a long drive to go from the free part of Germany to bring in things to the people of Berlin. And they knew that. This led to 2 million people being isolated in West Berlin, 120 miles inside Soviet territory with no support. So now all these people who were trapped there were literally trapped. And the only way that they could get help was to turn themselves into the Soviets. And people didn't want to do that because they were already seeing just how rough things were on the Soviet side. Lost your rights, freedom. There were spies all over the place watching people to throw them into secret prisons. Food shortages, all that kinds of stuff. It was like nightmarish. Nobody wanted to go live with the Russians.
No, I'm not.
Not even the
Right
Russians.
in bed.
You ready to move on? All right, so here we have a photo of some kids from, as you can see, like Berlin was still a really messed up place. But at the end of the war, when Americans and the Soviets went through, the place was just bombed to pieces.
Oh.
And this plane up here is actually delivering aid to those people who are still there. So the Russians may have cut off the roads, but we responded by instead using our Air Force to bring in the supplies for these people anyway. So following the division of Berlin, British and American aircraft crew flew in an average of 3 planes per minute for months in order to bring the city supplies. So this is a massive undertaking, like a military scale effort just to bring these folks like food, building supplies, aid, clothing, things like that, medicine. Meanwhile, Truman sent B-29 atomic bombers to Britain to send a message to the Soviets. So they knew that recently we had dropped nuclear weapons, atomic bombs on Japan. So we put some of our bombers within range of Russia. And we didn't bring A-bombs there, but we let them know that the bombers were there to try to send a message: you need to back off and let's bring supplies to the people or else. So in 1949, Stalin relented and allowed us to start using trucks instead, which is much more efficient and cheap because airplanes are expensive. The strong arm control that Stalin displayed in Germany led Western Europe to join the U.S. in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is NATO, in order to contain communism. And so NATO's whole point is it's an alliance of nations, United States and European nations, to try to stop Russia in case they do a military invasion. NATO is still around today, even though the Soviet Union isn't. But it's basically to try to help be one of those things to keep world peace within that part of the world. Following the formation of NATO, other agreements such as the Rio Pact and the Organization of American States were made to keep communism from the Western Hemisphere. So you also had agreements in like Latin America with the United States. They would keep these kind of things out as well. Though we will see later on that there will be parts of South America and the Caribbean that will kind of like go to like flirt with communist revolutions and things like that. So, especially when you start talking about like narco-terrorism and stuff like that. You get to the drug war. I think we'll do 2 more after this and we'll call it a day. I'll give you time to work on your assignment. I think it's due today. I remember. Ooh, we did it. Well, it's okay. It's just a little speech. Tell me about it. You know, he's known as being one of the best speakers of the modern world, some people say. So he was I don't know. Winston Churchill. So some people really like hearing him speak and the structure and the content and the meaning of his speeches. Well, hey, one thing you could do is you could listen to it. Like, you can find it on YouTube, like easy. So you can just listen to it. I mean, it was a speech. You gotta be careful with this recording though. It's kind of like, I think it kind of sounds like he's got marbles in his mouth.
It's so cool that like the number of B-29s produced are like about like 3,970, and all that's remaining today is 24.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's why like it's such a big deal when they go to like air shows.
There was this one, it was a B-25 Liberator,
Mm.
and they made 4 Model Cs, and other ones were like the B-25J. And the B-25C bombers had the turret in bottom, while the J's, they didn't have a turret in bottom. The gun,
Mhm.
and only one out of the 4 remained, but the only one was crashing to the Lexington Lake. What is it that? And they found it under there.
Wow.
There's only 1 out of 4 remaining.
I'd be happy with a Cessna. I would love to have like a little plane,
Cessna.
like a little old Cessna that I could just like, I don't know, just take out.
I've been watching a lot of documentaries,
Mhm.
like of the world wars and like. Yeah.
Neat. Gosh, I don't know. Maybe when I'm older, I could get my pilot license, but you know, I think that's like expensive.
Yeah,
I think
you can get at the age of 15.
Yeah. I think there's some folks here at the school do like the volunteer air patrol, maybe like the binoculars or whatever, and
Yeah, like
you're looking
kind
for
of like
fires.
power patrol.
Yeah, but you're looking for fires and stuff like that, I think.
Oh,
Like,
the fire watch.
yeah, but in an airplane. I forgot who it was. Gosh, I don't know. All right, next one. So during the Cold War, not everything was peaceful. A lot of things that happened, you're going to have global tension because of new nations being formed, such as Israel, like we see here. These are Israeli soldiers. But also, you're going to have what we call proxy wars, where like America's friends will fight Russia's friends, but we'll stay out of it because we don't want to start World War III. And so, all right, so the birth of modern Israel. During this period, Truman also supported the creation of a new Jewish state as a potential ally in the new Cold War. Though the movement to create modern Israel largely started in Britain earlier, around 1945, Truman asked that 100,000 displaced Jewish people be allowed to migrate back to Palestine. By 1947, the region lost its protection from Britain, and the UN sought to divide the region into 2 states, one Arab, one Jewish. On May 14, 1948, the UN, as United Nations, voted to divide the region, and Truman, with much American support, immediately recognized Europe as a nation. The next day, 7 invading armies and their auxiliaries, like mercenaries, invaded Israel, vowing their destruction. Israel defeated them in 9 months, but the region would remain a hotbed. It's like unstable throughout the Cold War. So, all right. So, for a long time in Europe and in England, there had been talk about sending Jewish people back to live in their ancestral homeland in Israel, right? Some people supported it because they thought it was like scripturally correct for Jewish people to live in Israel. So they were like, yeah, that sounds great. It's God's promised land to the Jewish people. Some people supported it because they literally hated Jewish people and just wanted to get them out of their country. It's called anti-Semitism. And some Jewish people supported it because they really and truly thought that it was their destiny to be back in Israel. It's expensive though. And not only is it expensive, but there was also other people living there. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people, and a Muslim majority already living in that area. A lot of and so it's going to be contentious. There are going to be people who move down there. they're going to have British and French protection for a while, especially British, but they're also going to be controlled by Britain. However, after the horrors of the Holocaust come out, a lot of people are really going to support the formation of Israel. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, look what all these poor Jewish people went through under the Nazis. So a lot of money and international support went to the creation of Israel because of the horrors of that. A place maybe where they could have their own country to defend themselves from not having another Holocaust happen again. It's not going to be very peaceful. Some land will be bought, some fighting will take place. It's constantly going to have a lot of instability and infighting and stuff like that between people who already live there and the newcomers. So since it was a Muslim majority, a lot of Muslim nations in the area were very upset about these new people coming over, these Jewish people. And so when Israel was recognized by the international community as a country, they got very mad. And so they vowed to destroy Israel and invaded. So all 7 of these nations invaded Israel. However, little, small, tiny Israel was able to defeat all of them. And it's not going to be the only time where they're going to have very slanted odds and just totally destroy their invading armies. And it wasn't like, hey, we kind of beat them back a little bit. No, they like totally wiped out whole armies. A lot of it with old weapons from World War II, like literally like with pistols and stuff like that. But a lot of these guys were World War II vets who learned a lot in the war and came back home. And Arabic armies traditionally in that part of the world haven't operated very well as modern armies. A lot of it has to do with how their authority system's set up and things like that. And so Israelis learned pretty quickly that if you take out leadership in those armies, the army kind of falls apart and disorganized. And so they were able to pick them off after that. So this totally shocked the world. And ever since, there has been countries that hated Israel, and Israel pretty much on the defensive, but also not only on the defensive, but also having a lot of quarrels with the Palestinian people who live there today. And so it's still a big deal, Pickle. But hey, folks, we're going to end our lecture there for today. We'll pick back up on Thursday, and I'll see you later. And for the rest of you,